Somewhere in the farthest reaches of the Gobi Desert lives a creature so terrifying, the very mention of its name can turn the scarlet cheeks of a Mongolian nomad white. This giant of the underground lives deep under the sand, only to emerge now and again to spray its human victims with a deadly poison. Its venom so powerful it corrodes metal. Its skin so toxic it brushes up against a human and you first hear a howl followed by deathly silence. As a Mongolian prime minister once warned, death is instant and there's nothing anyone can do to help. This is the story of one of the world's greatest mysteries, a nightmarish tale you can hear being told from one end of the Gobi Desert to the other. The Mongolian death worm, aka Ahai Hoche, is something to be feared and respected. When those wandering nomads see waves of sand created by the worm, there's only one thing to do: get away fast. Still, today, Western men on expeditions can be found in the yurts of nomads sitting around the fire telling them stories about those unlucky people that came upon this worm and didn't get away. The death worm is a terrifying thing, make no mistake. By all accounts, it doesn't come up often. It kills seemingly only when threatened, but sightings of it are numerous. For that reason, those Western-led expeditions have tried on a few occasions to unearth the truth about this monster of mystery. The last one wasn't even that long ago. We'll get around to that later. The first mention of the death worm was after an American paleontologist named Roy Chapman Andrews went on to that desolate part of the world in the 1920s. Back home, he wrote the book On the Trail of Ancient Man, and that's where he first heard of the deadly worm. In the book, Andrews writes that he never saw one himself, but in certain areas of that hostile desert, locals and officials would regularly talk about a terrible thing that lives under the sand and occasionally kills animals and their owners. This naturally caused quite a stir in the West. People were fascinated by the possibility that some freak animal might exist and had heretofore never been mentioned in any science books. In a second book called The New Conquest of Central Asia, Andrews mentioned the beast again, saying it's reported to live in the most arid, sandy regions of the Western Gobi. What really piqued the interest of Western scientists and the public alike was the fact that the Mongolian prime minister at the time, Zhaltan Sutet Dondibatsit, said it existed. With a name like that, he deserves to be heard. This is what he said about the death worm. It's shaped like a sausage about 2 feet long, has no head nor leg, and it's so poisonous that merely to touch it means instant death. It lives in the most desolate parts of the Gobi Desert. This was another fascinating thing for foreigners, the desert itself. At the time, parts of the Gobi were new territory for Westerners. It was a hostile place, and some of the locals could also be hostile. In the early 20th century, it was part of the earth that conjured up monsters in the minds of Westerners. The desert itself is a giant, covering 500,000 square miles and spanning much of China and Mongolia. It was the great unknown, an enigma, especially at its wildest west, where the huge sand deserts can be found. And that's the area where the death worm lived. Hardly anything was written about this place in a European language in the early 20th century. The only people besides the nomadic peoples that had been there were a handful of intrepid travelers. They talked about their journeys, but they were far from large-scale mapping expeditions. Then in 1923, something amazing happened. When a crew from the American Museum of Natural History arrived in the Gobi Desert, they discovered the first dinosaur eggs, or at least they were the first team to find dinosaur eggs and have them recognized as that by the scientific community. So when 3 years later a man said a giant death worm reportedly lives in the sand, for some people it wasn't hard to believe. We should say the American writer that reported this was not sold on the existence of the worm, but that didn't stop more Westerners arriving looking for the thing in the decades to come. As you'll see, there have been quite a few Western-led investigations since Andrews' feet grazed the Mongolian sands. The name Ahai Hoche can be translated as a large intestine worm. And that might sound like something you flush down the toilet bowl, but if you saw the thing in your bathroom, you'd be the one trying to get down the bowl. It looks rather like the worm that appeared in the Dune novels, but the Mongolian death worm doesn't have many of those worms' characteristics. According to the Mongolians that talk about the worm, it's not only deadly to touch, but it can kill from a distance by spitting venom at a person. If that isn't bad enough, it also has the uncanny ability to electrocute things. The good news is that it hibernates most of the year and can be seen mostly in the months of June and July, especially during rainfall. When it eats, it often chooses a wild plant known as goyo. The worm might also chow down on a camel, and if it does, it may well lay its eggs in the intestines. If there are no camels nearby, a rodent or even a human will do. Okay, so now let's dig a little deeper and see what happened on those other expeditions to find the worm. First, you have to know the word cryptid. A cryptid is an animal that science hasn't yet said is real. Cryptozoologists are the people that go looking for such animals. These mysterious entities can be found in just about every culture. In the US, you've got Bigfoot and myriad other cryptids from state to state. In Scotland, they have the Loch Ness Monster. In Australia, they have the man-eating yowie. One of the reasons such frightening entities came into existence was not some troll from history just making stuff up. Most of the time, it was down to people or animals going missing. On some occasions, the dead person would have been ripped apart as if by an incredibly strong wild beast. The first mention of a monster near Loch Ness dates back to the 6th century AD, when some unfortunate guy went swimming and seemed to have been eaten by a beastie in the water. When something can't easily be explained, humans throughout history have been known to make things up. For example, there are cases in Europe where serial killers were convicted of being werewolves. We don't need to tell you that they weren't. But because authorities back then didn't understand the psychopathy of serial killing, especially when it involved eating flesh, some people were found guilty of crimes of lycanthropy. It's the same with these monsters. Sometimes they're blamed for the mass killing of sheep or stealing children out of the fog or mutilating camels in the Gobi Desert. The question is the death worm something else in disguise? Let us now introduce a man named Ivan Machrele. He was a Czech cryptozoologist who went around the world looking for mysterious monsters. He once visited Scotland and spent some time there looking for Nessie, and another time he went to Madagascar in search of the elephant bird. The thing he really was interested in, though, what you could call an obsession of his, was the Mongolian death worm. Twice in the 90s and once in the early 2000s, he took a team out to the Gobi to search for the thing. He had a few theories about the worm. For one thing, he said it was only about as thick as a man's arm and only about half a meter long. He said it was blood red in color, had no eyes, no mouth, and no nostrils. He also believed the worm could deliver an electric shock, and he said it was indeed venomous, but that was because it often fed on the poisonous variety of the goyo plant. Did he find it though? Well, he came up empty-handed after his first 2 trips, and then on his 3rd and last trip, he was told by a Buddhist monk to go home or else his life was at risk. That night, he had a crazy dream about the death worm, and when he woke up, his back was covered with large boils filled with blood. Still, he never found the worm. It wasn't through lack of trying, though. Machrele's expeditions involved serious work, including interviewing a lot of people and even blowing up parts of the desert so they could investigate the depths. Other times, he scanned the desert from a plane using a camera. He found nothing, but according to his friends, he had a lot of fun trying. In 2005, the British Centre for Fortean Zoology followed in his footsteps. Instead of blowing up parts of the desert, they flooded parts and also dammed streams, hoping they could flush the thing out from where it was hiding. Alas, they also went back home having never seen a death worm. Richard Freeman, who led the expedition, said he interviewed scores of locals who claimed they'd seen the worm. He talked to a park ranger who said he'd seen it no less than 3 times. That night, the ranger invited Freeman to sleep in his guest yurt, the place where the ranger's wife told him that she'd seen the worm just 3 years prior. Another guy Freeman talked to claimed he'd killed the death worm in 1972 by throwing a rock at it. As the story goes, some Russians took the dead worm back to Russia, and now it's lost somewhere in the basement of a Russian museum. If it is, we wish they'd take it out for everyone to see. Freeman went as far as to speak to local governors who also talked about sightings of the death worm. In fact, in the interview we watched, Freeman talked for over an hour about how many people who had told him they'd seen the death worm, but Freeman himself didn't get so lucky to see one for himself. Does he think the death worm exists? Not really. Or if it does, it's not quite what the locals describe. They're terrified of it, said Freeman, but he also explained that as far as human deaths are concerned, it's always a friend of a friend's cousin who was killed, and those who actually claim to have seen it have only ever said they saw the worm killing a mouse. So much for a deadly monster. Then the Americans got in on the act a little later. In 2007, the TV show Destination Truth went in search of the worm, and yet again, the damn thing remained elusive. Still, there are many people in Mongolia that will tell you the thing is real and they've seen it with their own eyes. After the US TV crew went out there and some journalists from New Zealand arrived in the Gobi Desert, they didn't manage to capture the thing on film, but they interviewed locals who swore on the existence of the worm. Because the sightings peaked during the 1950s, a lot of these witnesses won't be around for much longer. So I feel pretty lucky to get to some of them before they're actually dead, said the lead journalist on the expedition. He did say, though, that in the cities people hadn't even heard of the worm, and it was only when they reached the desert areas that people talked about Ojai. Worms couldn't even survive under the sand. We can't blame the fact that it's called a worm on the English translation. The Mongolians never said it was a worm, only that it looked like one. That brings the question of what exactly have the people of the desert been seeing? Surely scores of people who saw a worm-like thing weren't all tripping or trolling. Well, it's ever so slightly possible that some strange, unheard of creature does live under the sand, but what's more likely is the death worm sightings were either some kind of snake or a legless lizard, and still the only venomous snakes in Mongolia are a kind of viper and an adder, and both are quite small and look nothing like the worm. They also wouldn't live under the sand. Then there's the steppe ribbon racer snake that better fits the description, but its venom is very mild to humans. There's the sand boa, which could possibly be found in the Gobi Desert. It looks like the death worm that people have described, and although it's not harmful to humans, folks around the world fear them just because they look so scary. Perhaps some people in the past saw a large snake or heard of someone being bitten by a snake, and over time around the campfire, the story evolved into a giant worm that can generate electricity. Our conclusion is not all these people were lying about seeing the worm, but as the story traveled, people's imaginations got the better of them. If such a worm exists, one of them would have been captured by now, dead or alive. Now you need to watch this: soldiers encounter mysterious monsters in Vietnam War. Or, for more monster madness, scientists find best evidence that the Loch Ness Monster actually exists.